Good morning. Greetings from the International Studies Consortium of Georgia and Reinhardt University. I am Raj Sastry, founding executive director of the consortium in Metro Atlanta. Our consortium was established in 1993, and we have been able to keep our head above water based on the support of the member and other institutions. We have already sent you an agenda and a flyer for today's program. Virtual conference on the modern Middle East, which will now proceed as planned. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the objective of our consortium is to provide domestic and overseas professional development opportunities for faculty members across disciplines so that they can increase the knowledge, understanding, and awareness of students they teach as they pursue a career of their choice. Our ultimate goal is to provide global and area studies competency skills through you to young men and women so that they can adapt and succeed in a highly interdependent global economy. As a precaution and in an effort to help us stabilize the Zoom connection, we request you to turn off your video cameras. During the question and answer session, please raise your hand and you will be recognized and can ask a question. Each faculty member is requested to ask only one question so that others will have an opportunity. We will take as many questions as time permits. Now, President Ingrid Sellers, are you ready?
I am, still do not have video, so I start off with an apology to all my colleagues.
That's okay. We'll take your voice. Now let me proceed. Let me proceed for welcome and greetings by President Ingrid Thompson Sellers of South Georgia State College of the University System of Georgia, with campuses in Douglas and Waycross, Georgia. She was appointed in May 2017 after leading the institution as an interim president since July 1, 2016. Prior to the appointment at South Georgia State College, Thompson Sellers served as a senior associate dean and professor of business information systems at Georgia State University. Along with her current role as president of South Georgia State College, Thompson Sellers serves on the board of trustees for Iona College, her alma mater, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, Commission on Colleges, and the Southern Association of Colleges with Associate Degrees. She is also currently a member of the Rotary Club in Douglas, Georgia. Thompson Sellers has a bachelor's degree in physics from the University of West Indies, master's degree in telecommunications from Iona College, and a doctorate in instructional technology from Georgia State University. She has written and made presentations on topics involving instructional design in higher education and corporate arena. Ingrid, please take it away.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you so much for your kind words. Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. I'm going to start off with an apology. Technology never works when you really need them to work because my camera decided that today is Friday and it's going to take the day off. So I apologize ahead of time. But I am so delighted and appreciative of the opportunity to say hello to everyone. And of course, thank you for joining us. I would like to greet you on behalf of the organizers and sponsors of the virtual conference on the modern Middle East. I'd like to also echo Raj's previous sentiments to say a special welcome back to those who are learning members of the consortium universities and colleges, and you have to support these events hosted by the International Studies Consortium of Georgia. But I'd also like to extend a very special and warm welcome to our new consortium members and some of our colleagues who might be joining this discourse for the first time. Welcome. So today, the International Studies Consortium has been in operation since 1993 and is celebrating 29 years of providing professional development opportunities with a focus on global education. Now, I cannot imagine being 29 years old and accomplishing so much and having so much of a profound difference, but the consortium has. And one noteworthy parallel in doing some research to greet you this morning, I noted that one thing that happened that was very, I would say, significant to this discussion, and it happened in the same year as the founding, as when the consortium was founded, because in 1993, there was a tentative agreement that was signed in Washington between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization for the Israelis' withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank town of Jericho. Some of you might remember this if you are not 29 years young, but I remember when President Reagan was was inaugurated as president that year, and that was a pivotal event in history. So two, I would say, notable historic events happened that we can note today within this conference. The work of the consortium over these years should be applauded, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and thank the conference organizers for putting together such an interesting program. We are very proud to host this event virtually with all of you, and I know that you're about to experience that very special programming today. Before we get started, and I turn back over the controls to Raj, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who played a role in making this event possible. First, I would like to acknowledge Executive Director Raj Shashti of the International Consortium of Georgia. His passion for international education far exceeds any other person that I have met. Thank you, Raj, for all you do.
Thank you.
Also, some special words of appreciation go out to our joint sponsors of the conference: Reinhardt University, Hamilton Lugar School of International Studies, and the National Resources Center of Indiana University, Center for the Study of the Middle East and Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center. And last but not least, thanks to all of our esteemed presenters whose job is to keep us all engaged in this subject matter of the modern Middle East. Your contributions as presenters today will help us to make this a successful event. Now, for all of us, we have chosen to be a part of a discourse that is focused on enhancing our knowledge of the modern Middle East. Now, oftentimes, what we see portrayed in the media doesn't actually reflect the actual reality. But now, because of today's conference, you will hear from our presenters. They are very well-respected scholars who have collectively spent decades in studying this region. I hope you will take as much advantage of this opportunity that will be presented to you to engage and learn from this experience. Well, I'm not going to take too much more of your time or the time away from the agenda. But before I turn it over to Executive Director Shashti, who will fill you in on perhaps more details of the day to come, I would like to again wish you a happy Friday and a fun-filled day of learning. Again, thank you for the opportunity to greet you. Shashti.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. We appreciate your time. I do not want to go into why our students should learn more about the modern Middle East. I have sent you detailed information as a part of the program. So we will now move to other aspects of the program. Now, this is with regard to those of you who are joining the program today, faculty members. You are very special today, for without you, there is no program. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to join our conference. To the extent we would like to send you copies of PowerPoints, multimedia resources, and audio and video links, please include your name in the list chat box so that we can have a record and make sure we reach out to you again. Next, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the U.S. Department of Education and the Center for the Study of Middle East and the Inter-Asian and Uralic Studies National Resource Center at Indiana University. My thanks and appreciation are specifically goes to all the officials and staff, including associate directors of the two centers, Carl Pearson and Cassia Rydell Johnston. Needless to say that I am also thankful for the support of President Mark Roberts and faculty and staff and students of Reinhardt University for co-sponsoring this conference. A few words about time management. To make sure that everybody gets the amount of time we indicated in the program, we will try to enforce the time slots very strictly. We request presenters to confine themselves to the presented slots allotted to them. We will also break for lunch breaks and refreshment breaks as indicated in the program. Now to your feedback during and after the conference. We take evaluation and feedback very seriously because this is a federally funded program, and therefore accountability is important for continued funding. On a related matter, we also want to serve you better next time. Therefore, at the conclusion of each presentation, please record your impressions in the chat box. We will soon send a link for you to provide us qualitative and quantitative formal evaluation as we attempt to add value to your professional development experience. And that is with regard to the evaluation. Now, please permit me to ask Associate Director of the Middle East at Indiana University, Carl Pearson, to provide an overview of the Center for the Study of the Middle East and the Inner Asian and Uralic National Resource Centers at Indiana University, Bloomington. Carl, please take it away.
Thank you, Raj. Good morning. It's wonderful to see you all today. On behalf of Indiana University, our thanks to Raj Sashti and the International Studies Consortium of Georgia for collaborating with us on this conference, and we look forward to more to come in the future. My name is Carl Pearson, and I am the Associate Director at the Indiana University Center for the Study of the Middle East, or as we call it by its acronym, which is CSME, we call ourselves Sesame. We are co-sponsors of today's event with the International Studies Consortium of Georgia and our sister center at IU, the Inner Asian and Uralic National Resource Center, or IAU-NRC. They simply preserve the letters in their acronym without trying to make a clever or not so clever word out of it. Raj has asked me to say a little about our centers and why we are interested in sponsoring an event like the one we have today. Sesame and IAU-NRC are 2 of 8 comprehensive national resource centers at IU, covering the entire globe. In addition to being national resource centers, we are also foreign language and area studies, or FLAS, fellowship granting centers. These are both competitive designations awarded by the US Department of Education with the purpose of supporting area studies and internationalization of education here at IU, in our state of Indiana, and throughout the nation. Also called Title VI centers after the section, that is Section 6 of the Higher Education Act of 1965, which provides our funding. We have a mandate to work to improve the political, historical, economic, religious, and cultural awareness of our specific world regions. We engage in outreach to K-12 students and teachers, develop academic events and activities, and collaborate with minority serving institutions to broaden and deepen knowledge of the rest of the world. As FLAS granting centers, we provide hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in scholarship funds to undergraduates and graduate students pursuing foreign language and area studies training. Part of our mandate is to prepare students for national service in government, education, business, and the nonprofit sectors. IAU-NRC is celebrating its 60th anniversary as an area studies center this year. Their area of focus stretches from Turkey in the west to Mongolia in the east and covers most of the territory in between, plus the Baltic states, Finland, and Hungary. They pursue both historical and contemporary analysis in a wide range of disciplines, including anthropology, business, comparative literature, economics, folklore, history, journalism, linguistics, music and drama, political science, public administration, and religious studies. And the languages they cover and offer FLAS scholarships for are a daunting list, including, but only as a sample, Estonian, Finnish, Hungarian, Kazakh, Mongolian, Persian, Tajik, Tibetan, Turkish, Uyghur, and Uzbek. The Center for the Study of the Middle East is of more recent origin, although its roots extend back beyond its founding in 2010. Its current director, Ambassador Faisal Istrabadi, who will address us this afternoon on the topic of US-Middle East relations, founded the center after the previous incarnation split into an area studies center, that is Sesame, and its sister center at IU with a more global reach, the Islamic Studies program. Sesame's geographical reach extends from Morocco to Afghanistan along the east-west axis, and from Turkey to Yemen going north-south. Like IAU-NRC, we celebrate and promote research in the peoples and cultures of a diverse and often misunderstood region. The 5 core languages we emphasize are, in alphabetical order, Arabic, Hebrew, Kurdish, Persian, and Turkish, and we grant FLAS fellowships in these languages, although other languages are spoken in our region, including Pashto, Dari, and Berber, among others. The missions of Sesame and IAU-NRC are to increase knowledge of these world areas, and so it was quite natural for us to enthusiastically accept Raj's invitation to develop a conference on the modern Middle East. We understand that for some, contemporary issues in the Middle East and Afghanistan, particularly among Americans, can be highly polemical and sometimes without perhaps an understanding of the complexities of these societies and their interrelations. We feel it of the utmost importance, therefore, to sponsor fora like the one today, in which we can come together to hear from experts on these issues and to develop a more nuanced and richer understanding of the challenges faced by people and governments in the Middle East and Afghanistan. We hope you find today's discussions enriching and that you are able to use some of the material you gained today in your classroom. Finally, let me invite you to contact either me or the Associate Director of IAU-NRC, Kasia Rydell-Johnston, if you would like additional resources or information about the Middle East or Eurasia. As National Resource Centers, we are available to help you find what you need to help you develop curricula that will enrich your students' understanding of these world regions. Thank you very much for your interest in areas that we find, I hope it goes without emphasizing, well worth thoughtful and respectful discussion. One technical note before I turn it back to Raj, and that is that I will be turning off your ability to unmute yourselves during the talks themselves, but I will turn that back on once the Q&A discussion begins. So if you have a question, as Raj said, please raise your hand, and then you will have the opportunity when you're called upon to unmute yourselves and ask your question or engage in discussion directly. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. We're very excited about today. I know that with these events, I always learn a great deal, and I hope you do as well. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Raj, and I'll turn it back over to him.
Very good. Carl and Kasia, thank you so much for your support and sponsorship. We sincerely appreciate it. For those of us who are gathered here, I want to share with you some background and context. As you are all aware, many of us teach undergraduate general education core curriculum courses. We do not have the robust resources, either in terms of personnel or in terms of people with living, working, studying, traveling experience and research experience in the areas in which we sponsor our conferences. Our hope is that as you go through these conferences, you will be able to catch ideas, concepts, methods, comparisons, illustrations, techniques that you can introduce into whatever courses you teach be it economics, be it social science, literature, women and gender studies, whatever it is, so that we can help you to enrich and enhance those courses. We also need your support in a different kind of way. I want to share with you something about the glorious past. I have received about $5 million in external funding, and about 3.5 million of that $5 million was to take American professors to study in all world regions: East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Central and South America. Unfortunately, those programs have become a shadow of themselves due to the budget cuts in the US Department of Education. Let me put it in a different way. It is the squeaking wheel that gets the grease. If you feel that these conferences are adding value to your professional development and teaching and learning experiences, please take a few minutes to send a 4 or 5 line email to your Vice President for Academic Affairs, indicating what are the few things that you'll be able to add in your course. How did this program contribute to professional development? And this will help us to document, especially if you mark a copy to me, send it to Carl and others who help to co-sponsor these conferences, so that these programs don't get relegated the same way that my group project abroad programs have become relegated due to deep budget cuts in Washington. This is a plea, this is not a request, so kindly keep this in mind as we move along, okay? Now I want to move to our first session for the morning. The topic is modern, first of all, Pierre, are you ready, sir?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Our first topic, modern origins of contemporary conflicts in the Middle East. Please permit me to introduce our presenter, Dr. Pierre Atlas, Senior Lecturer, O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, Indiana. Prior to joining the O'Neill School in fall 2021, Pierre Atlas was a professor of political science at Marian University, and for 17 years served as the founding director of the Richard G. Lugar Franciscan Center for Global Studies. A comparative political scientist by training, Dr. Atlas devoted much of his academic career to studying and writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and US foreign policy in the Middle East. At Marian, he taught courses in comparative politics, American politics, international relations, and global studies. In addition, he has also served as a peer reviewer for the Fulbright program. By way of education, he has a PhD in political science from Rutgers University, MA in political science, University of Arizona, and a BA in political science and history from University of Toronto. Please join me in giving a warm welcome, extending a warm welcome to Pierre. Pierre, please take it away.
Thank you, Raj. Can you see my the map on the screen?
Yes, we do. Can everybody see it?
Terrific. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Raj, and thank you, Carl, as well. And I appreciate everybody taking your Friday to be here for this conference. I'm going to, as Raj said, I am a political scientist by training, and when I was at Marian until last year, I taught a course in Middle East politics for 20 years. And so I'm going to bring in some things that I've covered in the past. I'm going to try and cover a tremendous amount of material in 1 hour. So I'm going to speak quickly, but you will be having access to all of the PowerPoint slides. If I don't go through everything, you will still have it. So the area that I'm going to be covering, basically, when we think about the traditional Middle East, it's the area within the circle that I have here, from Turkey to Iran to the Arabian Peninsula to Egypt. That's the traditional understanding of the Middle East. And that's pretty much the area that I'm going to be focusing on. I'm going to address 3 topics. The first is going to be the post-World War I Middle East and the legacy of British and French map making and how that has influenced a lot of what's going on in the Middle East today. I will spend a bit of time on the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then I will finish up with sort of an overview of regional conflicts from the perspective of geopolitics and the question of Persian Gulf security. So I'm going to hit the ground running. First of all, let's talk about the post-World War I Middle East. Here's some interesting photos. This first picture On the left is General Allenby marching into Jerusalem with the British Army in December 1917 after they had defeated the Turks. And then Great Britain basically occupied Jerusalem and much of what we call Palestine. I'll talk about that in a minute. The next picture actually is Faisal, of the leader of the Arab Revolt. And in the background, among the various people, is T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia. And then this is a photograph of a British passport for Palestine when Britain had the Palestine Mandate. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that. So this is where we're going to start, basically with the end of World War I and imperial and the redrawing of the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, I'm probably, you're all familiar with this. By the time we get to the eve of World War I in 1914, the Ottoman Empire has shrunk quite a bit from where it was a couple centuries earlier. And basically this purple area here, hopefully you can see my cursor. This is what the Ottoman Empire controlled in 1914 when World War I broke out. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. Its capital was in Istanbul, and it included what is today Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, what's known as the Hijaz down here, which is this part of what is today Saudi Arabia, where Mecca and Medina are. And then it also controlled certain aspects on the Persian Gulf as well. This was the Ottoman Empire. The lines on the map that you see here that are sort of vague are the lines of the modern states that exist today. But those states did not exist at the time of the Ottoman Empire. And so basically the Ottoman Empire was, as I said, multi-ethnic. It was Muslim, it was Christian, it was Jewish. There was a tremendous amount of indigenous Christians and Jews also living there, but and Muslims as well living together. There was tensions and all this kind of stuff. The Ottoman Empire makes the fateful decision of joining the Axis powers of Germany and Austria. They lose. And during the war itself, Great Britain and France are sort of working on what are they going to do when the war ends. And basically, they basically decided they were going to divide up what was left of the Ottoman Empire for themselves. And this becomes initially a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916. Whoops. And the bottom line is here was that they basically said, okay, the British, at this time, the British controlled Egypt. They'd been controlling Egypt since the 1880s. And they also controlled what was called the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which is Sudan today. So they controlled all of this. They had the Suez Canal. They had the Sinai, and also they had very, very strong interest in the Persian Gulf because of oil. And so basically what the British wanted to do when the war ended was they wanted to make sure that they were in control of land stretching from the Suez Canal, which was critical to British imperial control, all the way to the Persian Gulf. And so this was basically how they were going to divide it. They were going to make areas that were going to be under British influence or direct British control. And also the French were going to get some stuff as well. The area of what we call the Holy Land, which includes Jerusalem, was going to be an international zone. The idea was it was so important that it wasn't technically going to belong to anyone particular, but the British kind of understood they were going to be doing it. There were a couple of other promises that were made at the time, the Hussein McMahon correspondence between Britain and the Sharif of Mecca. If you guys revolt against the Turks, we promise you some type of an Arab state, vaguely somewhere. It was going to be basically in this general area. We can talk about that during the Q&A if you're interested. Also around the same time during World War I, the British made another promise to the Zionist movement, the Jewish movement, to reconstitute a Jewish home in the Holy Land, that we will do everything we can to help you build a Jewish national home in Palestine. And so these were we could say that these were conflicting promises, but the British didn't see it as conflicting because they saw a Jewish national home would be in some place in Palestine that would be under British influence. You would still have an Arab state. They basically saw that all these promises were consistent with their imperial vision for the Middle East. The reality when World War I ends and after the League of Nations is created, which of course is the precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations basically recognizes British and French interests, and they create a mandate system. The idea is the Ottoman Empire is defeated. Turkey is an independent country. Turkey is moving in its own direction. Turkey renounces any claims whatsoever to the Arab parts of what had been the Ottoman Empire. This is, you guys do what you want with it. We have nothing to. We're going to be Turkey for the Turks. And so basically, these are the lines on the map that you will recognize because this is the mandate. But this is basically what the countries look like today. Okay, there was going to be a mandate for Palestine. The Transjordan, which becomes Jordan. Syria was going to be a French mandate. The Syrians quickly break off part of Syria and create a separate mandate of Lebanon because Beirut had a very large Maronite Christian population that was linked to the Catholics, and the French saw them as the protectors. And Iraq, and I'm going to show you a couple of maps in the middle in a second. But anyway, this is the mandate system that's created after World War I. And it continues in various forms through the end of World War II. Okay, so it's really the interwar period. The British and the French are controlling these areas. This is what the mandates for Palestine and Iraq look like. So on the far left, this is the way under Turkish or Ottoman rule, the area that we would call Palestine or Israel or the Holy Land looked like. The lines on the map that we think of today did not exist. So the Turks or the Ottomans basically divided the area that they controlled into districts and provinces. And as you can see, you had different areas, and frankly, part of what would be considered Palestine or Israel today actually is today part of Lebanon. But it was part of this area under rule of different districts and provinces as ruled by the Turks. And to compare these two maps, we can look at the geography. So we have the Dead Sea down here at the bottom, and the Sea of Galilee at the top, and the Jordan River. And these are the natural barriers. Obviously, those don't change, but the maps themselves do. The shape that we think of today as Israel, Palestine, was actually drawn with the British mandate. So it's the British mandate that goes into effect in 1922 that creates the borders that are today in contest between Israelis and Palestinians. Before then, the borders were very different, and they were just vague areas. It was like saying the Midwest, as opposed to Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. Okay, I mean, it was just a general area. And so when you would say Palestine referred to sort of a general area, it didn't refer to a very specific place. Obviously included Jerusalem, but it didn't have these specific borders. The way like here on the with Egypt or up here with Lebanon, these were all created by the British and the French, recognized in international law by the League of Nations mandate. Same thing with Iraq. Under Turkish rule, what we call Iraq today actually was three separate provinces of the Ottoman Empire. One, Mosul, was predominantly Kurdish. The middle, the province of Baghdad was predominantly Sunni, and the one of Basra was predominantly Shiite. And the British basically put the three together, added some more land from the Arabian desert, and drew the lines on the map. Literally, it was British map makers that drew the line of modern Iraq in the 1920s. And this becomes the mandate for Iraq, which eventually becomes an independent country later on after World War II. Actually, it becomes independent in the 30s, but then it really becomes independent of the British after that. Okay, the one area that sort of, or with all these divisions and stuff, there is one group that is left out, and that's the Kurds. And so basically, a lot of the Kurds were hoping that they would have a Kurdistan, a land of the Kurds, as its own country. But the lines on the map that were drawn basically ignored Kurdish interests. And so today, the Kurdish population is predominantly in Turkey, but also in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and a little bit in Armenia. And so this is where you get a lot of Kurdish nationalism, a lot of issues that some of you guys may be familiar with. So not everybody got what they wanted, obviously, in this situation that ended. This is a map of, this is a fascinating map on the left. This is a map of the Middle East from 1926. And what's really interesting is it highlights what the countries were in the mandates, and it also highlights British influence. So what the British were concerned about during World War I, about maintaining control of the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf, they were able to maintain. So here, Egypt and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan is under British influence or control. In fact, the British are in Egypt until 1952, including the Sinai and the Suez Canal, which was critical to British security, because that was how Great Britain got to the crown jewel of the empire, which was India. Here you have the Palestine Mandate and Transjordan. It was called Transjordan because on the other side of the Jordan River. That's where we get Transjordan. After the 1948 war, it becomes the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which is what we call it today. The borders pretty much remain the same. Syria and Lebanon are under French mandates. And we have Iraq. So basically the British are controlling everything across. And then also the British controlled in one form or another, either as possessions or protectorates, the entire coast of the Persian Gulf and also the Indian Ocean here. So the Arabian Peninsula. This area here was desert and it was tribal. The country of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a state, does not come into existence until 1932. So this is a 1926 map. And of course, this is what the state system looks like today. All right. So it just gives you a sense of where things were and how things were sort of intended. And it's very important to understand how where we are today is in many ways, both the conflicts in Iraq between Sunnis and Shias, how Iraq broke up when Saddam Hussein was overthrown, various issues related to Yemen, the Persian Gulf, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian civil war, and how Syria was constructed with the French mandate. A lot of the issues that are going on today date back to how World War I ended and what happened with the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. I realize I'm going fairly quickly for this. When I used to teach Middle East politics, I would devote at least a half a semester to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm going to cover it in about 30 minutes. Okay, so let's move on here. First of all, some basic points about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the interpretation, my interpretation as a comparative political scientist. This is an ethno-nationalist conflict. It is a struggle between two peoples claiming the same piece of land. That is the essence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not a religious conflict. It's not a conflict between Islam and Judaism or Christianity. It is a modern political conflict that really dates its roots back to the late 19th century. It's a clash of two nationalisms that emerged simultaneously in the 19th century. Just by serendipity, they emerged at the same time. Arab nationalism, the idea that the Arabs living in the Ottoman Empire were distinct from the Turks. They had their own language, their own culture, their own traditions, their own poetry, everything. And there was a movement in the late 19th century saying that basically we should have our own country. We should not be part of the Ottoman Empire. We want an Arab nation. What that would look like was vague because, of course, the Arab world wasn't divided the way it is today into countries, all right? At the same time, in Europe, you get this Zionism emerges. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. And it's the idea that the Jews consist of their own people, and they should have their own country, because wherever the Jews lived, everywhere in the world, they were a minority, and they were facing persecution in most of the countries where they lived. And the idea was you end the persecution by reuniting, by bringing the Jews back to where they originated, which was the Holy Land, what we call Palestine, or Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And so Zionism and Arab nationalism emerged around the same time in the late 1800s. And over time, as the Arab states become independent, especially into the 1930s, and as more and more Jews are coming into Palestine and the British Mandate, the Arabs living in Palestine itself start to see themselves no longer as Greater Syrians, because Greater Syria was the area of the Arab world under the Ottoman Empire that was today Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. That area was referred to as Greater Syria, and Iraq was its own kind of area as well. And a lot of the people who lived in what is today Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan called themselves Syrians. That's what they saw, that it was all generally called Syria. But as these countries become independent, as Syria moves towards independence, Lebanon moves in a different direction, Transjordan is moving in its own direction, and the Zionist movement is only in Palestine. The Arabs of Palestine start to see themselves more and more as a unique Arab identity, not as Syrians, but as Palestinian Arabs. And so that makes it even more of an ethno-nationalist conflict. Palestine's formal geographic boundaries, as I've showed you before, were actually defined by the League of Nations mandate in 1922. The area that Israelis and Palestinians are contesting over today, kind of ironically, is within the framework of the boundaries that were created by the British and the League of Nations and codified in international law in 1922. Before then, as you saw under the Turks, it looked very different. The mandate was called the Mandate Period, which was from the 1920s until 1948, when the British leave and the war begins. This was the formative era for understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many of the things that basically laid the groundwork for the conflict were in this period. During this period, the Zionist movement was led by labor Zionists, who were socialist Zionists coming largely from Russia and other parts of Europe. They were building a Jewish community, a modern Jewish community in Palestine. The idea of building a state within a state. The idea was that at some point they're going to build a state, and they were building the institutions. As soon as labor Zionists arrived in the early 1900s, they immediately created competing political parties. They started, and it was very democratic in that sense. You had other streams of Zionism as well. At the same time, the Arabs of Palestine were not organizing politically in that way. They were divided along family lines. There were intense rivalries between different families and different clans within Palestine. There was a very serious class system where the wealthier landed Palestinians had no interest in Palestinian peasants. And so it was very much divided against itself in some ways, as the Zionist community was actually building a state within a state. There were other Zionists who rejected this. There was a lot of conflict between the Zionists as well, but they all sort of agreed that they wanted to have some type of a state down the line at some point in the future. And the Palestinian Arabs didn't really see that coming. Both Jews and Arabs are indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. The Jews of the Middle East, which are the Jews of North Africa, the Jews of Iraq, of Iran, of Turkey, these are Jews that trace their roots back to the first and second temples, and the Jews have lived in the Middle East and North Africa for 3,000 years. The Jews coming in from Europe with the Zionist movement they were European Jews, but as they came in, they were encountering indigenous Jews as well. And then, of course, as I'll talk about in a couple minutes, after the 1948 war, the vast majority of indigenous Jews from the Middle East and North Africa moved to Israel. And so Israel becomes a melange of European Jews and indigenous Middle Eastern Jews. And the European Jews, from their perspective, they were returning to their original roots. So this is a concept of return. And all this is happening at the same time that you also have indigenous Arabs. And so this is why we think of it as an ethno-nationalist conflict. Both Jewish and Arab national rights in Palestine have been recognized and established in international law for over 100 years. The claims of both have been recognized, going back to the League of Nations in the 1920s. I use the term Israeli-Palestinian conflict because really the essence of the conflict is between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the land that was created that was defined by the 1922 mandate. But there is a broader Arab-Israeli conflict, and that was basically between the state of Israel coming into existence in 48 and the neighboring Arab states. And there were a series of wars, 48, 56, 67, 73, and that was really the Arab-Israeli conflict. We get peace treaty with Egypt in 79. Things start to move, and then in the last several decades, it's been really more a movement towards a normalization of agreements, a normalization of relations between Israel and Arab states. I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. But the interesting thing is, today, 2022, Israel is actually developing pretty decent relations with a lot of Arab states at the same time that is in extreme contention with the Palestinians, which is a kind of an interesting thing. And maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. I want to jump into this real quick here. This is a really powerful quote, and I want to put it in context. Take a look and read through this. This is from 1905. This is during the Ottoman Empire. This is 9 years before the outbreak of World War I, when Naguib Azuri, who was a Arab nationalist writer, today we would call him a Christian Lebanese, okay? But he was in Greater Syria, writing in 1905. At this time, no one could imagine the demise of the Ottoman Empire. It would be like living in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and imagining one day it would cease to exist. So nobody could imagine that the Ottoman Empire would ever cease to exist. So the language he uses, the vision he has here in 1905 is really powerful. And this, by the way, is at the earliest stages of the Zionist movement. Two important phenomena with the same characteristics. And he's talking about Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism. Two important phenomena with the same characteristics, but which are diametrically opposed to each other, and which have so far not attracted notice, are appearing in Turkish Asia. And he's referring to the Ottoman Empire here, Turkish Asia. They are the Arab national awakening, Arab nationalism, and the latent efforts of Jews to reestablish on a grand scale their ancient kingdom of Israel. That's Zionism. These two phenomena are destined to be locked in perpetual battle until one prevails over the other. And he wrote this in 1905. Now, as a political scientist who studied this conflict, I disagree with that final sentence. I do not think that it's destined to be that way. There is a strong potential for resolving this conflict. I mean, it used to be, people used to say the same thing about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland it will never be resolved. A conflict between two peoples claiming the same piece of land, a political conflict, by definition, has a political solution. It can happen, and hopefully it will happen one day. But what he saw in 1905, he didn't see it. But the words he's talking about, he's not talking about Palestine. He's not naming any particular countries because they didn't exist. He's talking about Turkish Asia and the Arab awakening. The Arabs are becoming aware of their own identity, and they want to do something, right? So anyway, it's a really powerful quote. By the way, it's from what is probably the best single book, most even-handed and very, very informative textbook on the Arab-Israeli conflict, if any of you teach this class. It's David Lesch's Arab-Israeli Conflict, A History. The second edition is fairly recent, 2019. It has a lot of primary source documents as well as a very good text that's very balanced, and I strongly recommend it. Okay, moving on. So again, this was this is the map. These are the two maps that you're now familiar with. The first is what the Palestine area looked like under Ottoman rule, and the next is the British Mandate for Palestine from 22 to 48. In 1882, before the first Jews start coming to Palestine with the idea of they want to build something, in other words, before the Zionist movement really kicks in, there were approximately 400,000 or so Arabs and about 24,000 Jews living in this area. According to Ottoman census records, in Jerusalem, which is a very small town at the time, the plurality of the population was Jewish. And then you had Muslims and Christians. So it depends, if you lump Muslims and Christians together as Arabs, they outnumber. But in terms of religion, the plurality, even in the 1880s, before Zionism, the plurality of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish, followed by Muslims and Christians. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909 in the early era of the Zionist movement. And then after, in 1914, when the Ottoman Empire collapses. So by the time the Ottoman Empire, by the time World War I begins, you can see already the population of the Jewish population has increased quite a bit, as has the Arab population, obviously. And this is all before the British kick in. Okay. During the interwar period, or actually I'll go through this very quickly. This is the immigration to Palestine or Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, before World War II. And in Israeli history, they refer to it as Aliyahs or Aliyot, and Aliyah is an immigration wave that it has a religious origin, the word. But anyway, these are 5 immigration waves between the beginning of Zionism and the beginning of World War II. And this basically established the Jewish community known as the Yishuv in Palestine, that when the war comes in 48, it basically turns into the state of Israel. All right, so you have the first Aliyah, a lot of people went back. The second Aliyah is the founding generation. This is where David Ben-Gurion comes in. As soon as they hit the ground in 1905, rival political parties were founded and they started competing with each other in elections among the Jewish community. They founded the city of Tel Aviv in 1909. And then under British rule, the British come in, they take over at the end of World War I. The third Aliyah is also largely labor Zionists, and this is when Golda Meir comes in. The Haganah, which was the Jewish Self-Defense Force, is founded in 1920, as is the Histadrut, which was a labor union, but it was really a cradle-to-grave social welfare system for the Jewish community. So by the 1920s, they're already having healthcare and labor union organizing and all sorts of other stuff, and trying to really build an entire city. One of the problems, though, is as more Jews come in, what they need is they want to basically purchase land for the Jews coming in. The idea is we're gonna bring in all the exiles. So they're buying land in Palestine. Largely, the landowners that are selling the land to the Jews are absentee owners. They're Arabs. They're wealthy Arabs who largely live in Damascus or Beirut. They don't really care about the land itself. They own it going back to Ottoman days, and they're selling the land. And they're Palestinian Arab workers, peasants living on the land. But part of the agreement is, I buy the land from you, the land has to be empty. So a lot of the people are basically, they lose their ability to live on land, which they may not have had claim to in terms of legal documentation. But it creates an incredible resentment. So as more Jews come into Palestine in the 1920s and 30s, there's a clash between the Jews and the Arabs, because a lot of the Arabs are becoming unemployed. They're no longer living on the land. All this land was being purchased at a very high price by the Jews, but they were demanding that they wanted the land. So throughout the 1920s and 30s, there's a lot of tension. There are riots. Arabs are rioting against the Jews and against the British. And consistently during the 1920s and 30s, there are two demands that are being made by the Arabs of Palestine. And this is as the Arabs of Palestine are becoming much more cognizant of themselves as a distinct Palestinian identity, as opposed to, they don't see themselves as Syrians anymore, because their land is now in conflict with Jews coming in, which is not happening in Syria, it's not happening in Transjordan, it's not happening in Lebanon. And the two demands are this: ban the sale of land to Jews. They wanted the British to make it illegal to sell land to Jews, and they wanted the British to stop Jewish immigration from coming in. Stop land sales and stop Jewish immigration. Those were the consistent demands, because they saw themselves as being overwhelmed by Jews coming in. From the Jewish perspective, It's like, hey, especially getting in the 1930s, they're escaping anti-Semitism, they're escaping the Nazis, they're escaping all these kinds of things. They're returning to where Jews originated 2,000 years earlier, and they're buying the land. They're not stealing it. They're not using any kind of power. They have no power of estate. They're buying it. So it becomes a very intense struggle. Okay, by 1935, the Jewish population in Palestine had doubled from what it was before the British came in. And so you get a major Arab revolt takes place. Basically, much of Arab society in Palestine rises up in an insurrection or an insurgency, really an insurgency against the British and against the Jewish community. The Jews fight back. The British fight back as well. The British send in a commission in 1937, basically to say what's going on here. We have this partition, but we have two different groups claiming it. And the Peel Commission basically comes up and says, look, the partition is no longer viable. The partition of, excuse me, the mandate, pardon me, the British mandate is no longer viable. We have two peoples claiming this, and they said, this is not a struggle of right and wrong. This is a struggle between right and right. And what they said in 1937 was, look, the only way to resolve this is to divide the land and to split it up, to partition Palestine. And this leads to what I'm going to show you in a second. Now, the Arab side, the surrounding Arab world, and the Palestinian Arabs reject the partition plan. The revolt begins again, and as Britain is getting closer to World War II, and they realize something's going to be happening, by May of '39, they impose what's called a white paper, and they shut down all Jewish immigration into Palestine just as World War II is about to begin. So when the Holocaust is taking place, the British Navy is actually sending ships back of Jewish refugees trying to get to Palestine and sending them back to Germany. And so they basically said no. So at the moment when you really needed a place for the Jews to escape to, the British were saying no, you can't do it. But this is sort of, and this leads to Jewish resentment later on after World War II. Okay, these are some maps you may have seen. So let me kind of go through these quickly. I want to keep an eye on the time here. The one on the left is the Peel Partition Plan in 1937. This is what the British proposed. They said, look, you know, the mandate is no longer workable. Two peoples are claiming it. They both have legitimate claims. Let's divide the land. And the purple area, the smaller area, was going to be the Jewish state. The taupe colored area was going to be an Arab state. And the area in the middle here, you'll see this like it says Jerusalem. Jerusalem with a corridor to Jaffa, which is just underneath Tel Aviv here, was going to continue as a mandate under British control. The British in 1937 realized Jerusalem is too powerful and too potent and too important for Christianity, for Judaism, and for Muslims, and for the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim peoples to be either part of a Jewish state or an Arab state. The British were going to keep it basically for themselves under League of Nations mandate control. The Jewish state was going to comprise 20% of British mandate Palestine, and the Arab state was going to be 80% of British mandate Palestine, and the Arab state was going to be unified with Transjordan into one giant Arab state, which very much would, from the British perspective, was absolutely fulfilling the Hussein McMahon Correspondence. There was going to be an independent Arab state. They would be granted independence, and this would all be happening. The only Arab leader that accepted it was Abdullah, the emir or eventual king of Transjordan, because of course it would be good for him. But everyone else rejected it. All the Arabs rejected it. The Palestinian Arabs rejected it because, from their perspective, they didn't see Zionism as legitimate. They saw Jews only as a religion. They did not see Jews as a national or ethnic community that had a right to its own state anywhere, not even in 5% of Palestine. They said it's 100% of Palestine should be ours, and the Jews will live as a religious minority under our control. They rejected outright the concept of a Jewish state. The Jewish side accepted it, but because it became moot, it was no longer accepted. The British put the situation aside. Had this been accepted in 1937, you would have had a Jewish state, a small Jewish state, including Tel Aviv, that would actually been able to take in Jewish refugees escaping the Holocaust. That didn't happen. And you would have had Jerusalem under international control. Jump forward to 1947. World War II has taken place. The Holocaust has taken place. Illegal immigration. A lot of Jews were being snuck in during the Holocaust, but especially afterwards. And frankly, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure starting in 1946 for the British to start allowing some Jewish refugees to come in. By the time you get to 1947, There are about 1 million Arabs living in British Mandate Palestine, and the Jewish population has increased to about 600,000. Okay, by 1947-48, because it's a lot of Jews were coming in after the Holocaust is over, after World War II ends. They start coming into Palestine, and now both Arabs and Jews are very much against the British, and the British come to understand in 1947, look, the war is over, our economy is doing very badly, we're not going to deal with this anymore. They tell the new United Nations, we're out of here in May 1948, you guys come up with a solution. 1947 was also the year that the British pull out of India, and the idea of partitioning, of taking land claimed by different people and dividing it into separate countries is in vogue. You know, India is being partitioned in 1947. The UN designs this partition plan for Israel and Palestine, and basically now the kind of purplish area is going to be the Jewish state. The tannish color area is going to, the tannish area is going to be the Jewish state. The purple area is going to be the Arab state. Jerusalem was going to be on United Nations control. It was going to be an international city under UN control. That's the blue in the middle. The Jewish side immediately accepts it. The Arab side rejects it. A civil war between Jews and Arabs breaks out in 1947, the day after this is passed by the United Nations. And then when the British pull out in 48, Israel declares itself as an independent country. It's immediately recognized by both the Soviet Union and the United States. And the day after it declares its independence, it is attacked by Arab countries, and you get the 1948 war. Okay, and the 1948 war, I got to pick up this pace here. 1948 war basically ends because what happens is when the 48 war begins, the Arab countries invading are not fighting for Palestine. They're not fighting for the Palestinians. Transjordan wants to grab as much land for itself as possible, and it takes this whole section, what becomes known as the West Bank, the western side of the West Bank of the Jordan River. Transjordan takes the West Bank. The heaviest fighting is in Jerusalem. Jerusalem ends up being divided. Transjordan or Jordan captures the eastern half of Jerusalem that includes all the holy sites and annexes it to Jordan. Egypt captures what becomes known as the Gaza Strip in 1948 and keeps the Palestinians there under Egyptian military occupation. And Jordan grants Jordanian citizenship to all the Palestinians living in the West Bank. The term West Bank did not exist before 1949 when the war ended. It's where the war ended. The concept of East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem did not exist before 1949 when the war ended. It was like East Berlin and West Berlin. It's where the war ended. Jerusalem is a 3,000-year-old city. It's only been divided for 19 years, from 1949 until 1967. In its 3,000 years, that's the only time it was ever actually formally divided between two countries. Anyway, so when the war ends, Israel takes more land than it was promised in the UN partition, which was moot because it was rejected by the Arab side. Jordan captures the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt captures the Gaza Strip, and this is what it is. This becomes known as the 1949 armistice lines. It's also known as the pre-1967 boundaries of Israel. So we talk about the pre-67 boundaries. This is it. The line here separating the West Bank from Israel comes to be known as the Green Line. So these are terms you might hear about the Green Line or the pre-67 borders. This is it. Okay, picking up the pace a little bit. And by the way, I'm not going to go through all of this. But you will have the PowerPoint slides and you can see it. I put this together. When we're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have what we call the 1948 issues. Okay, when the war ends, as I just said, this is sort of the division. Palestinians, there were about 1 million Palestinians. By the time the war is over, 750,000 out of those million are refugees. They're either driven out by the Israelis, they flee because of war. Every war creates refugees, or they were encouraged to leave by Arab states because they wanted to invade. There's multiple reasons for why the Palestinian refugees became refugees. The bottom line, though, is that when Israel became a sovereign state, it said, we now have sovereign borders and you can't come back. We will not let you come back. And instead, they brought in massive numbers of Jewish refugees from the camps in Europe, and also massive numbers of Jews fleeing from the Middle East, coming into Israel. So it was a population exchange in a sense that happens here. And I have that laid out here as well. The bottom line, though, for the 1948 issues, when we're looking at, okay, how do we resolve the conflict or what's going on today? What about the refugees from 1948? And do they or some of them have a right to return to what is today Israel? If all of them came back, Israel would no longer be a Jewish majority and could it be a Jewish state? But what do you do? I mean, any kind of resolution of the conflict, there's what about the Palestinian refugees and the right of return? global recognition of Israel. A few countries recognize Israel, but not a lot do. So any kind of resolution involves that as well. What will the final borders of Israel and Palestine be? The West Bank border is not an internationally recognized border. It's an armistice line. It's where a war ended, but there's no, excuse me, the West Bank border is, the border between Israel and Jordan is recognized with the peace treaty, but the West Bank itself is internal, and it's not a formal sovereign border because it's where the war ended. It's not, there's no state of Palestine. Will Israel have a two-state, Israel-Palestinian company have a two-state solution, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine, or will all of what was 1948 Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, become one state? Frankly, Israelis don't want that because they don't want to be, they want Israel to be a Jewish state. That was the Zionist idea. A lot of Palestinians don't necessarily want that either, unless it's a Palestinian Arab state, but then the Jews would not accept that. Another important point to make here is that the 250,000 Arabs that remained in what becomes Israel, that did not become refugees, they become Israeli citizens, and today they constitute about 20% of the Israeli population within Israel itself, not in the West Bank or Gaza. Okay, moving on very quickly. This is sort of the refugee flow. So this is basically a lot of the 1948 refugees from Palestine went to the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, and they came under Egyptian or Jordanian rule. A lot went to Lebanon, a lot went to Syria, some went to Europe, some came to the United States, but basically this is the dispersal. Around the same time, you also had about 650 to 800,000 Jews indigenous Jews of the Middle East that mostly went to Israel. Some went to Europe and the United States, but mostly went to Israel. Before 1948, the population of Baghdad was 1/3 Jewish. The Jews of Iraq traced their roots in Iraq back to the Babylonian exile of 2,500 years ago. The Jews were living in Iraq for 1,000 years before Islam. And so they were there. They were indigenous Jews in Iraq. They were kicked out in 1948. There were massive amounts of Jews in Morocco. They were kicked out because it became very hostile. Where did they go? They went to the new Jewish state, and they were absorbed. The entire Yemen Jewish population that had been in Yemen for 2,000 years was evacuated by the new state of Israel between 1948 and 1950, and they were all brought to Israel. So all the Yemenite Jews are now living in Israel. Jews from Iran, all these, it becomes like this. So the Palestinians become dispersed, and the Jews come in, and this is part of the reality of the issues today. Jumping forward, I'm skipping a lot. I'm sorry. But the next major important issue is the 1967 Six-Day War that takes place in June of '67. If you're interested in the Q&A, we can talk about it. I have some information here on the slide. The bottom line is that when the war ends, Israel launches a preemptive strike. It was about to be attacked. When the war ends, Israel captures all of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, captures the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and ends up on the eastern side of the Suez Canal. It also captures the Golan Heights from Syria, which was the high ground that the Syrians were using to shell and bombard Jewish farms on the Israeli side, here. So this is basically the capture in 1967. This is Israel today with the West Bank and Gaza, and then Egypt gets to Sinai back in 1979 with the peace treaty. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these things. So we had the 1948 issues, but now we have the 1967 issues, okay? When the war ends in '67, Israel now controls 100% of what was British Mandate Palestine. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, okay? And all of those Palestinians that were in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem don't become Israeli citizens like the 250,000 that stayed in 1948. They come under Israeli occupation. So Israel from 1967 until today, within Israel itself, is a vibrant democracy, but outside of Israel in the West Bank is an occupying power. And this creates all sorts of conundrums for Israel, a lot of obviously hardships for Palestinians, and this is again part of the issue. So now we look at the 1967 issues. They're kind of different from the 1948 issues, but both of them are on the table. And if you want to resolve the conflict, they both have to be addressed. So Israel immediately annexed, unified Jerusalem and annexed it and said all of Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. So in any kind of resolution, what about Jerusalem? Can it be shared as the capital of two states? What's going to happen? The formal division that existed in '49 is never going to happen again. And again, out of 3,000 years of Jerusalem history, it was only divided for 19 years. It's not going to go back to that formal division. It'll be like saying, let's go back to East Berlin and West Berlin. That was a circumstance of war. But that doesn't mean that that Palestinians have very strong claims. Muslims have strong claims to Jerusalem. Christians do. as well as Jews and Israelis, okay? That's a major issue. That's a 67 issue, not a 48 issue. Israeli occupation and rule over the Palestinians in the West Bank, Jewish settlements in the West Bank, because the Jewish settlements have increased in the West Bank, and there's some very militant settlers who are committing acts of violence as well. If there's going to be a two-state solution, what will the borders look like? Also, there's the Golan Heights issue with Syria. That's a separate issue, but that's also a 67 issue. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. There are no more Jewish settlers in Gaza since 2005, and I'll talk about that in a second. Keeping an eye on the time here. So Jerusalem is its own baby. Probably several of you or many of you have been to Jerusalem. It is truly an incredible place. It is, frankly, in my view, it's too important to be the capital of even of two states, let alone one. I think it should be an international city. But anyway, this is sort of ground zero of the religious, cultural aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and sort of the broader Arab-Israeli and Jewish-Muslim conflict as well. This is the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif. This wall here is the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall. This is the holiest site in Judaism, and this is where Jews pray. They put notes in the wall and that kind of stuff. Above this, on top, this here with the gray dome is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. And this is the Dome of the Rock, which is another mosque, which is the most beautiful thing in all of Jerusalem, and it's the most recognizable thing. It's also a mosque, and it's very contentious as well. This is a picture of me, and when I was directing the Franciscan Center for Global Studies, I was there with some Franciscans. This is an interesting shot because this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And to give you, and here's the Dome of the Dome of the Rock. And so you get a sense of just how close, literally, this is all in East Jerusalem. This was the area that the Jordanians captured in 49, and this is the area that the Israelis recaptured in 67, and is now, so this is like kind of the ground zero. And if it exists in peace, and tourists from all over the world come, they make pilgrimages there. It's an incredible place, but it's also very contentious. It's a very contentious area. Okay, keeping an eye on the time here. Real quickly, Israel today, to give you a sense of the size of this, this is Israel compared to the United States. One scholar, I love this quote, he said, the problem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is too much history and not enough geography. A lot of stuff going on in a very small area of geography. Within Israel itself, and when I say Israel itself, I mean the pre-1967 borders, which is the democratic state of Israel, 75% of the population is ethnically Jewish, 20% is Arab. And of that 75% Jewish, it's about half of a European background, half of either Middle Eastern or Sephardic background. And most Israelis have grandparents from across the board, most Jewish Israelis. So it's a very much of a melange. Religiously, about 75% Jewish, about 18% Muslim, about 2% Christian, less than 2% Druze. Of the religious identities. And this gives you some basic things here about Israel. For the West Bank and Gaza, first of all, to give you again the size of how small the place is, this is the West Bank, this is Gaza. At its narrowest point, pre-1967 Israel is 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. So Israel is never going to go back to the 1967 lines, because an invasion would basically cut off Israel in a matter of hours. So most of the Jewish settlements are actually built around the border here, and there's some smaller ones as well. But this is part of the problem. So today in the West Bank, there's almost 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, and about 420,000 Jewish settlers. East Jerusalem also has about 216,000 Jews living in East Jerusalem who have moved in since. Now, when the 48 war took place, the Jordanians expelled all of the Jews that lived in East Jerusalem, and the Jewish quarter was razed, and about 55 synagogues were destroyed by the Jordanians. So the entire Jewish presence was destroyed in the eastern part of Jerusalem when the Jordanians took over. When the Israelis captured it back, the Jews went back in with a vengeance and really rebuilt the area and are claiming it for themselves. And so again, it's highly contentious. Palestinians want it for themselves, Jews want it for themselves, and so this is part of the problem. The Gaza Strip today, a very small piece of land, has almost 2 million people. All Palestinian. And as you guys know, from the peace process and everything, basically you had the West Bank is under control of the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. The Palestinian Authority is from Fatah and the PLO. It's more secular. It recognizes the state of Israel. And there's actually increasing cooperation even today, literally as of the last few days, between Israel and the West Bank Palestinian Authority on economic issues, on things like that. They cooperated on security. Hamas was taken over by, Gaza was taken over by Hamas, which is the Islamic Resistance Movement, which is a more radical Islamist movement. And they control the Gaza Strip. And there's a lot of contention between Israel and Gaza with Hamas, and they fought each other. Hamas was the ones that used a lot of suicide bombing against Israel. Israel has used a lot of military actions against Gaza, and these are things that are sort of happening as well. Hamas is supported financially and logistically with weapons by Iran and Hezbollah, which is interesting because Hamas is a Sunni organization, whereas Hezbollah and Iran are Shiite, and that actually leads to some tensions in Gaza. In fact, just a couple days ago, there have been protests in Gaza over the idea that Hamas is being supported by Iran, which is actually killing Sunnis in Syria, and a lot of Palestinians. There are virtually no Shiite Palestinians. They're all the Muslims are Sunnis. Have a lot of sense of kinship or with their fellow Sunnis in Syria who are being killed by the government supported by Shiites. And so they're saying, "What, Hamas, what are you doing?" And so it's very interesting, very complicated. Nothing is really simple in this situation. Okay, real quick. So on the Jewish Israeli side, again, I think it's important to understand just how diverse it is. They're basically the Jewish side of Israel. 75% of the Israeli population come from basically every country in the world. And so all of these pictures are Jewish Israelis. This woman here in the Israeli military uniform is of Ethiopian background. So the Ethiopian Jewish population is in Israel. So these are everything from Ethiopian to Yemen to Iraqi to Jews that had traced their roots back to Russia or Poland or England or whatever. Okay, and so these are all Jewish Israelis. There's a very strong gay rights movement. The largest pride parade in the Middle East takes place in Tel Aviv. And so this is women serve in the military. There's a lot of egalitarianism. It's a parliamentary democracy, all that kind of stuff. These are Arab citizens of Israel, Druze and Palestinian, Palestinian Muslim and Palestinian Christian, and then the Druze, which is sort of their own separate kind of ethno-religious group that are found in the mountainous areas of what is today Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And there are Druze in all of those areas, there are Israeli Druze, there are Syrian Druze, there are Lebanese Druze, but they're all of sort of the same kind of. It's an offshoot of Shia Islam, but we can talk about that in the questions if you're interested. But anyway, this is all part of the diversity just within, and this is all within the 1949 boundaries, pre-67 boundaries of Israel. Israel has a parliamentary system. I'm not going to go through all of this. The bottom line, which is really kind of interesting, is that in the most recent elections, for the very first time in Israeli history, every Israeli government and parliament has been a coalition. No party has ever won an outright majority. It's always been a coalition of parties. For the first time in Israeli history, an Arab party in the Knesset is part of the government. And it's not just an Arab party, and it's an Islamic party. And the leader of Mansour Abbas, who's the leader of the party, is actually a leader of the Islamic movement of Israeli Palestinian citizens. And so it sort of gives you a sense of the diversity here. And this is a picture, the signing of the agreement between the major leaders. The current prime minister here is Naftali Bennett, and then the leader of the major left leader in the government is Yair Lapid, and then you have here you have Mansour Abbas. Also, very interestingly, just a couple of weeks ago, again, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very contentious. But at the same time, Israel is having really good relations with a lot of Arab countries. And here, the president of Israel, the symbolic head of the Israeli state, made it the first state visit to the United Arab Emirates. And here he is with the crown prince, basically reviewing the UAE military. And so this is a really kind of interesting thing. The bottom line, though, here, and I'm going to really just do the last part very quickly. Part of the problem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today is that there are many, many people on both sides who refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the other side. So here, for example, this is an Israeli map or a pro-Israel map that doesn't even have the lines of the West Bank or Gaza, which would have been a part of a Palestinian Arab state. Okay, they don't recognize, they don't even have it here. Here is a map of Palestine, a pro-Palestinian map that does not, and Israel is a sovereign state. It's been a member of the United Nations since 1948. Okay, it's a sovereign state. It's not even listed. Tel Aviv, which is the largest city in Israel, isn't even on the map. completely eliminates Israel entirely. This doesn't recognize any Arab presence in Israel on this map here. And then what I find again ironic is this is a Palestinian nationalist kind of symbol icon. And again, this boundary that Israel is claiming for itself here with the Golan Heights. You'll notice that the Palestine one doesn't have the Golan Heights because that's part of Syria. But anyway, these boundaries were drawn by the British and the League of Nations in 1922. This is not biblical Israel. This is not Arab Palestine going back centuries. This is what is being fought today. Nobody's fighting over this part, which is Lebanon, which used to be part of under Ottoman control. That would have been part of what we call Palestine today. I mean, it's kind of an irony, all right? I find that kind of interesting. All right, so I've got about 15 minutes left. I want to end on time. Let me just go through this really quickly. It won't take as much time. I want to sort of hit some of the other things, stepping out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to some of the other regional conflicts, focusing on the strategic interests, the strategic value of the Persian Gulf. So this is the Persian Gulf. Okay, Israel-Palestine is up here. To put things in perspective, here's the Persian Gulf. And what countries border the Persian Gulf? Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and then here's Yemen down here. Okay, the choke point, this narrowest point right here, called the Straits of Hormuz. All right, more than 50% of the world's proven oil reserves are located in the Persian Gulf region. Half of the world's proven oil reserves are here. This is why the Persian Gulf is so important. This is why the United States really cares about Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. If there wasn't the oil, frankly, I don't know if we'd be spending so much time on this. And from an American foreign policy perspective, about 20% of the oil traded worldwide flows through the Straits of Hormuz every day. So even though the United States is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, we get most of our imported oil from either Canada or Mexico, and then we produce our own. The global economy runs on oil, and the global economy is very much impacted by Middle Eastern oil. Okay, so let me go through this really quickly. Great Britain, as you saw on that 1926 map, Great Britain basically controlled the entire Persian Gulf area. In 1971, they withdraw. Bahrain becomes its independent country. United Arab Emirates becomes an independent country. What happens? Well, the United States steps in to basically take over the British role of Western interest in the Persian Gulf. It becomes known as the Nixon Doctrine. The United States did not have any troops or presence in the Middle East. What we call it was over the horizon. And we relied on proxy countries to protect the Persian Gulf and American interests. And what were those countries? They were Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah, pro-American. And these were known as the twin pillars of America's strategy in the Persian Gulf. The US at the time called the Shah of Iran the policeman of the Gulf. And we gave tremendous amount of money, weaponry. CIA had big listening stations there so they could listen to the Soviet Union. Part of the Cold War, think about this, it's in Cold War context. In 1980, something happens in response to two very important things from 1979. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution takes place and the Shah is overthrown. Months later, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, which is right next to Iran. And now all of a sudden the Soviets are in the area and Iran is in a revolutionary situation, very anti-American. At this point, President Carter declares the Persian Gulf to be a vital interest of the United States and declares that the United States is willing to use force if necessary to defend the Persian Gulf and access to oil. This is the Carter Doctrine, and this has shaped American foreign policy ever since. The Iran-Iraq War breaks out. Saddam Hussein starts it, trying to seize disputed islands that were claimed by both Iran and Iraq. And basically, he also frames the conflict to try and unify the Arab world on his side. He frames it as a Sunni versus Shia conflict. Iran is predominantly Shia, the revolution is Shia. Iraq is a Sunni, and he basically tries to construct it as a very fundamental us versus them kind of conflict. The Iran-Iraq War is the bloodiest war in the history of the Middle East. Over 1 million people are killed. About 500,000 are killed on both sides. I mean, it is by far the bloodiest conflict in the history of the Middle East. During this period, some of you may remember, with the Straits of Hormuz in danger, the United States under President Reagan reflags Kuwaiti tankers with American flags escorted by the US Navy to make sure that neither the Iraqis nor the Iranians attack American ships or attack oil tankers going in. So this is like one of the first American military missions, in a sense, into the Persian Gulf. Basically, also the US realizes we have to be able to send troops in if we need it. So we develop what's called the Rapid Deployment Force, which becomes over time Central Command, CENTCOM. CENTCOM is actually created in this era because of the interest in the Persian Gulf. Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990. threaten Saudi Arabia, and really the Carter Doctrine goes into force. It is a vital strategic interest. The United States is willing to go to war to push Iraq out of Kuwait. We all know about this. It's a major coalition under United Nations resolutions. When the war ends in 1991, the United States does something it's never done before. It establishes permanent basing in Saudi Arabia. And the main reason was to enforce all of the sanctions against Iraq after the Gulf War. But this is very controversial. It's nowhere, the American forces are nowhere near Mecca and Medina. However, Osama bin Laden very much sees this as these are infidels, the Western power, and they're near the land of the two holy mosques. And he basically, this is one of the major driving grievances for Osama bin Laden to take on the United States, was the fact that American troops, so-called infidels, are based in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. In 1996 and 98, he declares war against the United States. Most Americans don't even know that he did it. In the 1990s, when Clinton is president, basically now it says, okay, you know, the two major threats to the Persian Gulf and to American and Western and global interests in terms of energy and everything else are the Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Iran under the Islamic Republic. And he basically evokes what's called a dual containment. We're gonna contain both Saddam's Iraq and the Islamic Republic of Iran. In order to help do this, the Fifth Fleet is constituted as a U.S. naval fleet whose sole purpose is to patrol the Persian Gulf. The United States, this didn't exist before, and the Fifth Fleet is headquartered at bases built in Bahrain in 1995, and from 1995 to this point, the U.S. has a major military permanent naval presence in the Persian Gulf, which, by the way, leads when the Arab Spring takes place in 2011. It's one reason why the United States basically supported Bahrain in cracking down on its democratic protests, whereas we were supporting the people in protesting against Mubarak. I wrote a journal article about this. Basically, the United States was following its interests. We didn't want to upset and lose the possibility of losing our base in Bahrain, so we supported the non-democratic regime, whereas we were much more willing to cut our ties with Mubarak in Egypt. Recent conflicts. After 9/11, we get the Iraq War. Saddam is removed, which leads to a lot of issues. I would say the mismanaging of the Iraq War ultimately empowers Iran. I would say ultimately who won the Iraq War? Iran won the Iraq War. That in a bumper sticker, that's the way I would put it. Keeping an eye on the time here. Okay, good. The Arab Spring breaks out. Again, I'm sort of going through kind of like the greatest hits of the last few years. Of all the countries in which the Arab Spring takes place, the country where it began, Tunisia, is really the only country to go through a democratic transition. It's having some problems today, but basically it's the only country that really moves towards democracy. In every other country where the Arab Spring takes place, you really don't get a major change of regime that lasts and moves into democracy. Out of the Arab Spring, one of the major crackdowns on peaceful protests leads to the Syrian civil war. To this day, over 500,000 people have been killed in the Syrian civil war. The vast majority by the regime, by the Assad regime, which is supported today by Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. And of course, the majority of the Syrians are Sunnis, and they are supported by Saudi Arabia, other Arab states. You have moderate Sunnis that are there, mostly victims. You also have some jihadist groups. And eventually out of all of this emerges ISIL, ISIS, the Islamic State, and it takes territory in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. operates to push back along with others, the Russians are as well. Nobody liked ISIS, and work with Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi military, defeats them on the ground. And although the ISIS is still around and they're still doing certain things, but they no longer control territory the way they did in a minute, the way they did recently. I'll show you in a minute a map of that. In 2015, the United States goes into negotiations with Iran on the nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA with P5+1. In 2015, the agreement is reached, but then when President Trump comes in, he withdraws from the agreement, and Biden is actually trying to restart negotiations with Iran about this. Into all of this comes the civil war in Yemen, which also breaks out in 2014. It's ongoing today. They're wildly different estimates of how many people have died, but some estimates, the United Nations estimates about 300,000 have died so far. Let me point this out. Although the Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli conflict gets most of the attention, more people have died in Yemen since 2014 than Arabs and Israelis combined from 1948 until today. I mean, the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of actual people dying in conflict it has been fairly low intensity. I mean, there were some wars where there were more people dying, but the Syrian civil war, the civil war in Yemen dwarf the Arab-Israeli conflict, but they don't get the kind of global attention, media attention, in part because maybe it's Arabs against Arabs and maybe the Western media doesn't care as much, but it's really kind of horrible. But anyway, this has become sort of a proxy war. It didn't really start that way, but a proxy war between Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is Sunni, and Iran, which is Shia. The Houthi rebels are Shia. They're not the same kind of Shia as Iran, but the Iranians are supporting them. And in recent weeks, they've been firing missiles at the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of tension that's going on there. Oh, I'm going to end on time. And then what's really interesting in all of this, even as Israel is occupying parts of the West Bank, even as Jewish settlers are committing violence against Palestinians, even as Hamas is still committed to the destruction of Israel, and you have rocket fire every once in a while, all these kinds of things, even as all that's happening, in the broader Arab-Israeli concerns, Iran is seen as a common enemy and a common threat. And Israel and various Arab countries have been coming together, uniting and realizing our differences are nothing compared to our concern about Iran. And so what this has led to in the last couple of years has been a normalization of relations, which is really kind of interesting. And it was known as the Abraham Accords. So Israel signed normalization because none of these countries recognize, they refused to recognize Israel. They did not recognize Israel existed. They would oppose it in UN and all sorts of stuff like that. But now United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have now recognized Israel. They are formalizing agreements. 2 days ago, Israel and Bahrain signed a security cooperation agreement to exchange intelligence and even some military stuff because they are both very concerned about Iran. And Saudi Arabia has not done this, but none of these Gulf states would be doing any of this with Israel unless Saudi Arabia was telling them it's okay to do it. Down the line, it could very well be that Saudi Arabia and Israel will formally come into some type of an agreement, which is very interesting because that would have been unthinkable in the past. My final two slides are images. I just want to get, and I'll end on time. This is CENTCOM. This is Central Command. This is what came into existence after 1979, 1980 with the Carter Doctrine. And of course, for those of you who are familiar, it's a military region, and this is way beyond what we would traditionally call the Middle East. But Central Command, the U.S. military divides the world into different commands, and CENTCOM is this area. It's stretching all the way from Egypt to Kazakhstan. Okay, but in the middle is all of this, and of course, the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq and the Afghanistan war were all fought through CENTCOM. Okay, and then the last picture I have, this just to give you a sense of ISIS. So in January of 2015, at its height, the Islamic State controlled all of this area, all this reddish area of Iraq and Syria, including Mosul. One of the claims, one of the demands, they wanted to establish a caliphate, and they flat out said, we are going to erase the Sykes-Picot agreement. We are going to erase the boundaries between Syria and Egypt, excuse me, between Syria and Iraq. We're going to erase the boundaries. We're going to establish an Islamic State, and countries don't matter, and it's going to be under our rule. And it was a terrifying thing, extreme violence. You're all familiar with it. Over time, the United States, first in the Obama administration, then in Trump administration, and continuing into the Biden administration, the U.S. military is on the ground in small numbers, working with Syrian Kurds and other forces, and also the Iraqi army to push them back to the point where in March of 2019, they've lost all control of their territory. They're still around. There's still a lot of fighters, and there's still a threat, but they no longer control it. So this was the Islamic State. If we'd been giving this talk a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, one of the major focus of this discussion would have been the Islamic State and what they're doing. And it's really quite amazing. They came out horrific, controlling countries, taking over countries, and now they're down to basically a terrorist group and no longer controlling land. Back to where we started, this is the general area we're talking about, and I am done. And I actually ended, wow, I ended a minute early. You can unfasten your seatbelts now. And I'll leave this up, but let's see if I'll leave this up in case I want to refer to anything during the questions and answers. Thank you for your patience. I hope you're still around, and you will have access to all of the slides with the information I didn't get into. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, good.
So feel free to, let's see, raise your hand, and you now have the ability to unmute yourself. So alternately, you could just unmute and ask questions.
Okay. Pierre,
Yes.
before the question and answer comes, I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation, very illustrated and very timely presentation, because many of our students, probably if you give them a world map, may not, at least 4 out of 10 may not know where the Middle East is on a world map, given the way the oil prices have gone up recently and the significance of the Middle East and everything. But more importantly, I'm sure you are much more technologically savvy than I am. If you can convert the entire PowerPoint presentation into a link and send it to us, I would really appreciate that. Okay?
Okay, very good.
Thank you. Now,
Sure.
questions, please.
Heidi Dempsey?
I'm done. And can we unmute them so that they can ask questions, Carl?
Yes.
I unmuted myself. I was just curious about why the British were willing to give up control in that region after World War II. Did they not know there was oil there then? Because that seems like a huge economic engine that they basically gave up power to.
That's a good question. No, the reason the British wanted to control the Persian Gulf was because of the oil. Going back to the late 19th century, when the Royal Navy converted from coal to fuel oil for their ships. No, basically, I mean, after World War II, Great Britain is devastated economically. There's a movement. The Labour Party comes into power. There's sort of an anti-imperialist sense in the British government, and Britain withdraws from India. I mean, India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. In 1947, they withdraw from that. They don't want to have to deal with the protest movements. Same thing in Palestine, the Palestine Mandate, and then over time they don't have the economic resources to do. I mean, Britain remains under very strict rationing into the 1950s. So basically, economically, they don't have it. The British people don't want to do it anymore. They don't want to. They're tired of fighting, and so they were fighting. They had to send in 1946. In the 1930s, the Arabs of Palestine rose up in a revolt. Starting in 1944-45, the Jews of Palestine rose up in a revolt because of the Holocaust, and the British were not allowing Jewish refugees in, and they started attacking. And the British had to send in 300,000 troops into Palestine to quell everything. After the war ends, and it's like, we don't want to do this anymore. So that's pretty much what was happening. And then, of course, over time, just imperialism is no longer viable or acceptable in many ways. There's, in the 50s and 60s, basically all of the world is sort of decolonizing in one form or another, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So that's how you sort of get that. But and then the idea was also, as the countries that were coming into independence were designed to be pro-British. So the Kingdom of Iraq, the monarchy of Iraq, was a pro-British monarch. Transjordan was pro-British. Even the current king of Jordan, Abdullah II, was educated at Sandhurst, which is the British Military Academy. I mean, so there are these traditional British links. It doesn't necessarily mean the countries are still going to be pro-British in terms of their orientation, but for a very long time, that was the idea. Iraq was, it was going to be, they didn't know that there was going to be a revolution in 1958, a bloody revolution in Iraq that overthrows the monarchy and then eventually leads to authoritarian regimes. They didn't know that was going to happen, right? They thought we were going to have these very pro-British, there'll be Arab countries, but their foreign policy orientation will be towards the British. And that's how they sort of saw things happening. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
There are 2 or 3 questions in the chat box.
Are you gonna read those, or am I gonna read them?
You can check it out, sir.
Okay,
Because that way you can prioritize, time is of essence.
Okay, hang on a second here. Let me.
Somebody asked about the Balfour.
Okay, hold on. I can't see the way with my screen on, I can't see the chat. So could somebody read the chat questions?
Pierre, how about I just read them to you?
That'd be great. Thank you.
The first one is, can you talk about integration issues faced by Jews from Ethiopia? And I think this question was asked while you were talking about Israel. So the question is, can you talk about integration issues faced by Jews from Ethiopia in Israel?
Yeah, so I'll even go back farther than that. The Zionist movement was Eastern and Western European Jews that came in, okay? And these European Jews were European, and they had European prejudices against people who were not European, just like every other European did. And so even in the 1950s, when Moroccan and Iraqi Jews and other Jews were coming in from the Middle East, there was a really rough integration process, because a lot of the people in charge of bringing them in, frankly, a lot of them had racist attitudes. I mean, they were all Jews, but you're not white. And so there was this, it was really difficult. Now, that doesn't really exist so much anymore, but the 1950s was a very tough period where there was a sense that the Jewish Holocaust survivors might have been treated better than, say, the Jews coming in from Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia or Iraq or whatever. And so there was a problem with that. A similar thing happened with the Ethiopian Jews. I mean, on the one hand, Israel evacuated the entire Jewish Ethiopian community, thousands of them, and that had been in Ethiopia for centuries. I mean, and they brought in, but as you saw in the pictures, I mean, these are dark-skinned African Jews. And so there has been difficulty with that as well. I mean, some Israelis are more prejudiced than others, just as you would see in the United States. You know, some Americans are more prejudiced than others, and you have that kind of a thing. Other Israelis saw, hey, we're all Jews, it doesn't matter. What has happened over time is, again, the initial integration was very difficult and problematic. Over time, that's become less so, especially as more and more people intermarry and rise through the ranks. So now you have Ethiopian Israelis, Ethiopian Jewish Israelis who have risen through the ranks in the military. And by the way, in Israel, the Israeli Defense Force is really the melting pot vehicle for Israelis. Unless you're ultra-Orthodox Jewish, every Jewish Israeli serves in the military, as do some Arab Israelis. And basically, that is the place where everybody is sort of integrated in a way, and it's a very important social institution in Israel, not just a military institution. And it's through military service that basically you get this more of the development of equality among people. But definitely, especially in the initial years, was very problematic. There was a lot of resentment. There was a lot of prejudice. And I would say over time, that's become less and less so. But there's still pockets of it, frankly, just as we see in every country, that happens in a lot of places. And it really kind of depends on individuals. But institutionally, it's definitely much better than it was in the early years. In the early years, it was pretty rough.
There's a question about the Belt and Road Initiative. Any impact on this geopolitical reason?
Interesting. You know, the China is investing everywhere. Israel and China actually have a lot of economic development ties. Israel has actually been providing China with some technology that becomes controversial because the United States wants to make sure that any of the Israeli technology doesn't have American technology that goes to China. The relations there. China is very much involved in the Middle East in general. I don't have if you look on, I focused on the Red Sea. I focused on the Persian Gulf, but the Red Sea is another area of sort of contention. And China has bases in Djibouti, along with the United States, along with Turkey, along with other places. So China is actually trying to establish a presence, economic presence, and political influence everywhere. And so they have relations with UAE. They have relations with other countries in the Gulf. They are trying not to take any particular stance on any issue because they want to have good relations with everybody. So they want to get involved in taking a position in any of the conflicts, and whether it's Yemen or Syria or Arab Israeli or anything like that. But they want to expand their influence, their economic influence, which then also increases their geopolitical influence as well. So they're definitely there.
I think there are a few more questions in your chat box, too, sir.
Carl, if you can read those.
Can you talk about British imperial incompetence in the partitioning of Palestine and India?
So yeah, when the British first go in, first of all, Britain goes in Palestine. They go in militarily. Okay, so it's the British Army that goes in, and actually Palestine is first run by the British military from about 1918 until 1922 when the mandate kicks in. When the mandate kicks in, Britain actually goes in naively. I wouldn't say incompetently. They took the mandate seriously. And the mandate, the preamble for the mandate actually takes the Balfour Declaration, which said, Britain promises to establish a national home for the Jewish people, do everything it can to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. while not prejudicing the rights of the other people living there. And that's a tough balancing act. But the British went in with this idea that, okay, we're going to do everything we can to help create a national home, whatever that means, and also help the Arabs. And what they initially proposed was joint governorship, joint rule. They actually created the equivalent of a parliament where Arab and Jewish representatives would be together and would actually help draft policy that the British would then implement. The Arab side refused to sit at the table with the Jewish side. And this is back in 1920, 1922, in the early 1920s. They refused to do it, but they actually went in with this idea, hey, you know, we have a responsibility. The whole idea of a mandate, by the way, was that it was very patrimonial and colonialistic kind of a thing. But the idea of the mandate was that these newly independent places coming out of the Ottoman Empire are not yet ready for independence. So we're going to put a Western power in charge with a mandate to tutor them and to bring them up to the level of where they can become independent. Okay, so it's a very patronizing kind of an attitude. But the British actually went in with the idea that we're going to take this seriously. We are going to bring them up, and we're going to have we want to have Jews and Arabs living together, and we're going to have them cooperate and all that kind of stuff. It very quickly, even before the mandate kicked in, there were riots in 1920 when the British military was there, with the Arabs rioting against the Jewish presence. It very quickly came to realize that the British, this isn't working. So then they started dealing with the Arab side and the Israel and the Jewish side separately. Okay, and then they had like a divide and conquer kind of thing. Then they tried to play one side off against the other, and ultimately, the naivete of the first High Commissioner shifts, and then as you're getting into the 1930s, especially with the threat of fascism, and Italy takes over Libya, okay, in the 30s, and so the fascists are there, and the Nazis are being involved as well. The Nazis are trying to get the Arabs to rise up against the British. So the British, their attitude is basically, our primary interest is protecting the Suez Canal and controlling our area, and so we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that things don't get out of hand. And that's why every time there was a riot or an uprising, whatever, the British would send in another commission. They'd try and come up with a resolution. But the bottom line is they did whatever they could to try and keep things calm so that the British interest would be paramount. So you could call it, in some ways it's bungling, it's mismanagement. I would say it started with naivete. And then by the end, by the time you get to 1948, they're sick of everybody. But when they're pulling out militarily, and the war has already started, they're deliberately pulling out in such a way that the Arab side will be able to take over British military bases. Because frankly, by the time you get to 1948, a lot of the British in charge in Palestine, first of all, are anti-Semites. They don't like the Jews at all. And part of it is because they've been dealing with the Zionist movement, but also there's a very strong strain of anti-Semitism in Britain anyway. And some of the people who rose in the Foreign Office were very anti-Semitic. And the Foreign Office is having much more control than the Colonial Office. The Colonial Office, which at one point was actually under Churchill in the 1920s, was much more sympathetic to Zionism. So the Colonial Office was sympathetic to Zionism. The Foreign Office was not. The Foreign Office basically said the Jews are a problem because we need to have alliances with the Arabs, and we don't like Jews anyway. And so you get this kind of a tension that goes on. I would say in the question of the Palestine Mandate, it really isn't so much incompetence as but there is definitely mismanagement. And then by the time it's over, they just said, we're sick of this. We're done with it. And we're out of here. And we're out of India and all this kind of stuff. So, frankly, the fundamental thing about imperial rule is it's fundamentally anti-democratic. It's fundamentally authoritarian in the sense that ultimately, no matter what they do for the local people, even if they put some local people in charge, the imperial power is ultimately interested in its own interests, not in the interests of the people it's ruling. And so there's always that fundamental issue that in any imperial power, whether it's the British, the French, the Dutch, whatever, the Spanish, whatever, you always have that, right?
Dr. Nurullah has a question. Nirmal, can you ask the question, please? Nirmal. Carl, can you unmute Nirmal? Well, it's in the chat box. Yeah, go ahead, Nirmal. I'm sorry, something is not working.
I see John Powell with a hand up.
Yeah, good. I think before that, there was a question from Nirmal. Okay, go ahead. Anyway, John, go ahead.
Dr. Atlas, thank you for the fantastic presentation. That was quite thorough. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. This question actually comes from something a student asked years ago, and it stuck with me. Now, you displayed some optimism in this area earlier. I was wanting you to follow up on that, specifically regarding the Israelis and the Palestinians, not involving the success that I think began with the Carter administration and Egypt recognizing Israel for the first time, just the Israelis and the Palestinians. The student asked, is it possible the two-state solution will literally never work? You displayed optimism there, so I was wondering, what would you point to that would indicate to any observers that there could be a successful, peaceful two-state solution specifically between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Well, first of all, I apologize if I appear too optimistic. 10 years ago, I was more optimistic than I am today. The bottom line is every day we're moving further away from the possibility of a viable two-state solution. That's the downside. Is it theoretically possible? Absolutely. There have been Palestinians and Israelis of goodwill who for 20 years have mapped out what it could look like. The problem is ultimately you have nationalistic claims, the idea of two peoples claiming the same piece of land, and increasingly more and more of those people are unwilling to share it in any form. And frankly, Israel over the last 20 years, especially, it's a democratic state, but the people have been putting into power coalition governments that are becoming more and more right-wing. And the more right-wing they are, the less willing they are to move in the direction of a two-state solution, which would require Israel to withdraw from large portions of the West Bank. And what that would also mean would be for Israel to withdraw a lot of the settlements. And so the settlement movement is very powerful. I mean, Israel think of it as an interest group that has a tremendous hold, and it's very and they become, some of them are becoming much more militant. The Arab Spring and the instability in the Arab world surrounding Israel has actually made it have made moderate and more peace camp Israelis more skeptical of the idea of allowing a Palestinian state to come into existence, because what happens if it gets overthrown? And what happens if it becomes anti-democratic, which they don't believe it would be democratic? It will. And Israel's 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. The instability there is making things very, very nervous. Hamas has never recognized Israel, and Hamas still says that every inch of Palestine, meaning 1948 Palestine, should be turned into an Islamic state. Frankly, most Palestinians don't want that. They don't want to live in Hamas in some ways is like a Palestinian Taliban, and most Palestinians don't want to be under Hamas rule. So you have all of that. So it frankly makes it, unfortunately, less possible. And in addition to that, as Israel expands the settlements, unless the settlers are pulled out, there's less and less land left over to become a Palestinian state. Now, what's interesting, what's happening now is the new government and Netanyahu, the new government, the new leader and the new government is definitely very different than the one led by Netanyahu, who was prime minister for many, many years. They're actually working with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, even like in the last few weeks, to increase economic opportunities. There's been an increase in trade in the last few months between Israel and the West Bank, economic trade and things like that. Is that going to replace the idea of statehood for the Palestinians? Probably not. But the more Palestinian livelihood, daily life gets better, the less possibility of a resumed armed conflict. So really, I mean, one of the questions is it going to be, I think the concept of a one-state solution of all of 1948 British Mandate Palestine becoming one sovereign state is not going to happen. Some right-wing Israelis would like to have that as a Jewish state, the entire thing as a Jewish state. Some Palestinians want to have it as a Palestinian state with no Israel whatsoever. Israel has 8 million people. Israel's not going away. Okay, it's a sovereign state. It's there. It's not going away. So a one-state solution, I don't believe is possible, but a two-state solution theoretically is possible, but it's not likely. I think what's more likely to happen in the ensuing years is not conflict resolution, but conflict maintenance, I guess. I mean, sort of keeping things quiet, if that's possible, moving in the direction of the Israeli government's being encouraging more economic relationships, perhaps lightening up on controlling Palestinians' daily lives, which is a really big deal. It's a real pain in everybody's butt. I mean, they have all the checkpoints and a lot of them are unnecessary. It's just a question of exerting control. I mean, those kinds of things without an actual state, because I just don't see that happening in the near future. But I think it's theoretically possible. And the irony is, in the 1990s, we were moving in that direction. Frankly, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by a Jewish extremist who thought he was giving away too much, and it really sort of the peace process sort of started in a downward spiral slowly from that point forward. And then you get the second Intifada in the 2000s with suicide bombings, and now you got the wall that's been built, all these kinds of things. It's making it more and more difficult. Although ironically, the wall that divides Israel and the West Bank actually, in a sense, kind of creates a de facto two-state kind of thing in some ways, because a lot of the Jewish settlements are on the other side of the wall. And so what does that mean? So there's potential for it, but it's going to take leadership. And one point that I've made in some papers that I presented at conferences years ago was whenever you've seen movement towards any kind of peace among Israelis and Palestinians, or Israelis in the broader Arab world, there's been a synchronicity between the Israeli leader, the Arab leader, and the American leader. And whenever they were all on the same page, something happened. Whether it was the disengagement agreements in the 70s after the 73 war, whether it was Camp David, whether it was Oslo Accords, you had that. But there have been times when Israelis have put forward proposals that the Palestinians have rejected. There have been times when Palestinians have put forward proposals that the Israelis rejected. There have been times when both sides were actually willing to talk, but the American government wasn't interested. It takes all three on the same page at the same time willing to do something. And that's becoming less likely as Israel moves to the right, as the Palestinians have, they have not had a presidential election since 2006, and Abbas is in his 80s, and nobody even knows who's going to replace him when he dies. The Palestinians are divided geographically between the West Bank and Gaza, and ideologically between Hamas and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. So there's no unified Palestinian thing, and the Israeli. So all these kinds of things make it actually. I'm not as optimistic as I might have sounded in my presentation, but I think it's theoretically possible, and hopefully one day it will happen. I don't see it happening anytime soon. That's my long answer to your short question.
Excuse me, sir. The one of the Dr. Nirula's mic is not working. He has got a question in the chat box. If you would kindly take a look at it, I would appreciate it.
I can read it. Is it true that Israel wants to build its own canal to minimize the control of Egypt on the Suez Canal?
I have never heard anything about that. That seems implausible. Israel has first of all, Israel has two major ports. One is Haifa, which is on the Mediterranean, and the other is Eilat, which is in the Red Sea. In fact, you can sort of see it here. So frankly, I'm pointing at it right at the very bottom of Israel. I'm using my cursor on the map here. And that's a direct access to the Red Sea. And the Suez Canal is pretty much open now. I mean, Israel and Egypt have pretty good relations right now. Israel and the Sisi government, they both see Hamas as a threat. And Egypt also doesn't like Iran very much. So they're actually doing well. The Suez Canal is no longer an issue, frankly. It was a major issue in 67 and 73 with those wars. But that's not really an issue anymore. And again, so with Eilat, as long as they have access through the Straits of Tiran, which is this tiny little part here, which Egypt blockaded in 67, which was a casus belli, and that was one of the factors that led to the 67 war. And they, then it was a hostile. When Egypt had a hostile relationship with Israel, the Suez Canal was an issue, but that's not really an issue anymore.
Time for one or two more questions.
This is Peter Makaya. Given the political atmosphere in Israel today, which type of Zionism would best describe Israel?
That's a good question. Yeah. So that's a good question. There's a wide variety of Zionism. I mean, again, Zionism is Jewish nationalism tied to the land. I mean, basically the common idea of Zionism is that Jews constitute a people like the French or the Irish or the Italians or the Arabs, And as such, they have a right to their own country in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. That's all Zionists would agree with that. But there are religious Zionists who believe that, you know, the biblical Holy Land of Israel, which all happens to be in Jerusalem and the West Bank. The biblical Holy Land is not the coastal plain where Tel Aviv is. So when Israel took the West Bank in 67, that's when, especially after Likud came to power in 77, you got so these religious Zionists who were saying that if we resettle the biblical holy places, it will hasten the coming of the Messiah, which is, you know, okay. So it's the religion, Jewish theology and Zionism are tied together with religious Zionists, and that drives a lot of the settlement project. Not all, but a lot. But then you also have more socialistic Zionists who actually were quite willing to not only live with, but they wanted to, you know, full equality for Arab citizens and all this kind of stuff, and very different. So there's a whole spectrum. But I would say that in general, and then you have what people, there's even something called post-Zionists, which are kind of more like a very ultra progressive Israelis. I call themselves post-Zionists. I think, frankly, today, there isn't so much of a philosophical debate over Zionism as there was like in the formative years during the mandate period. There was intense debates, even violence, between left-wing and right-wing Zionists in the 1930s and 40s in Israel, in Palestine. But today, it's really not so much about what kind of Zionist are you. It's more, you know, what is your position on the territories, and what is your position on the Palestinians? And I don't know if there's so much philosophical, ideological coherence the way there used to be. It's more, this is our land, and you'll have people who want to keep the West Bank for strategic reasons, who couldn't care less about the religion, and they're not very religious themselves. And you have people who are there because this is God's land, and we will fight to the death for it. And they're together in a sense, because they want to keep the land for different reasons. So you can't necessarily say it's their understanding of Zionism that's driving what they're saying. I think it's more strategic, and how they see the relationship with the Palestinians. There is Israel's relationship with the Palestinians is obviously a major factor, but there's a tremendous amount of difference among the Jews themselves. And there's kind of a joke in Israel that, you know, once Israel resolves the Palestinian conflict, the real conflict is going to be between the Jews of Israel themselves. You know, who is a Jew? Who gets to define who is a Jew? If you're a secular Jew, do you have to follow religious mandates and these kind of things, including on marriages and stuff like that? I mean, there's all sorts of, you know, are some people rejected Ethiopians because are they really Jewish? Or even some of the Russians who came in, are they really Jewish? Who gets to determine who a Jew is to be part of a Jewish state? And it's a whole conundrum of stuff that frankly is sort of tamped down because of the conflict with and the concerns with the Palestinians. Just like, you know, there's incredible divisions among the Palestinians themselves. And that makes it kind of difficult too. Anyway, I strayed. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's good.
Any other questions? On behalf of the consortium and on behalf of the NRCs at Indiana University, I would like to thank Pierre for a thumbnail sketch. Trying to do this in 1 hour, probably a history that goes more than 45 years, is very difficult. So I think we have one more question. What would be the future of Palestinian refugees be? Yes. Is it a main issue?
Yeah, that is a major issue. Now, what's really interesting about the Palestinian refugees, and I know you guys in your classes probably deal with other types of refugees. The Palestinian refugees have their own international law definition that is different from every other refugee community in the planet. And that is when the war ended in 48, a special organization was created called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine. And this is before the UNHCR was created, the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner for Refugees, okay? So UNRWA basically was created specifically to deal with Palestinian refugees. And the definition of a Palestinian refugee is anyone who descended from a Palestinian from 1948. So therefore, the Palestinian refugee, remember, there were about 750,000 Palestinian refugees in 1948. Today, there are 5 million Palestinian refugees. It doesn't matter if they were resettled. It doesn't matter if the Palestinian is third-generation American born. That person is still legally, under United Nations definitions, considered a Palestinian refugee and is entitled to be counted as a refugee. That category does not exist for any other refugee community in the world. Everyone else, every other refugee population in the world comes under the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, And your refugee status is not multi-generational. Once you get resettled into a third country, or you go back to your home, you're no longer a refugee and you're taken off the rolls. With the Palestinian refugees, that doesn't happen. So one of the big questions becomes, what do you do with the refugees? Well, is it the immediate descendants of 1948 or 1967, the ones who fled the West Bank in Gaza when Israel took them? Or is it how many generations? So there has been discussion, again, if there's a will, there's a way. Okay, so when things were going okay, you had between Israelis and Palestinians, they were talking about maybe a symbolic return of so many thousand refugees coming back. But there's no way, there's not one Israeli across the political spectrum, far left to far right, that is willing to say that 5 million or even 2 million Palestinians can return to Israel. And these will be like the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of the original refugees. Because first of all, that would overwhelm Israel. Israel is a Jewish state. It's democratic and has a Jewish majority. If it maintains its democracy and no longer has its Jewish majority, the Jewish state could be voted out of existence. If Israel is no longer a Jewish majority and it wants to maintain its Jewishness, it's going to have to give up democracy. There's a tension between Zionism and democracy. As long as Israel has a Jewish majority, that tension is not a big of an issue. So that's part of the Palestinian refugee question. The other question is, what about resettling? And it doesn't have to just be resettling. So here's the thing. There are multiple options. There can be compensation. There can be, there's repatriation. There's settlement into third countries. Third countries can agree to do it. Okay, we're out of time. But anyway, so that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, it's 10:31. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
I apologize for being rude to you, but
no, I totally get it. Totally get it. Absolutely.
It is all on Zoom rather than in face-to-face, where it'd be a completely different situation. Let us try to, we will take a 15 minutes break. And if you can come back like 2 minutes before 10:45, we would really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Pierre, thank you. And please send me the link. Okay.
I will. Very good. Okay.
Have a great day.